Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for some people to filter through our doors, our virtual doors. So imagine if you're walking into an auditorium, you can't all walk in at once. So the door would get a little clogged. So we have to wait and allow people to filter in. So that's what we're doing. And if you just give us a short moment to allow everyone in, we'll get started with our evening. I hope you're all having a good evening. The weather was fine today. Yesterday, not so much, I think. Now it's all a blur. What was yesterday's weather? All right, I think I'll get started with a little bit of housekeeping. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Kelly Greenlee. I am speaking to you from Prince Memorial Library in Cumberland, Maine. And I'm very excited to be here tonight. It's very exciting to have this kind of offering, to bring this kind of offering to you. So I'm so glad that you came to join us. A little bit of housekeeping. There is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. If you click on that icon at any point during the presentation with a question, you can type in your question in the box, and that question will come to me behind the scenes. And I will make sure that Elizabeth and Dustin, our presenter, can see those questions, and we will try and address as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So I think I will begin. I'd like to begin with just a moment to offer gratitude to the Wabanaki people who for hundreds of years have inhabited and cared for this land upon which we stand. Many thanks. So consider this your official welcome to the second offering of what we sort of behind the scenes are calling our Changemaker series. It's a series that we hope highlights the people who are making an impact locally, bringing about change to our communities. And last month, we heard from Molly and Dana, who is the ambassador for the Penobscot Nation. And if you missed that super informative presentation, it is available on our website, princememorial.org. The recording is there. So if you haven't had a chance to tune into that, you can certainly still do so. And tonight we have our second installment in the Changemaker series. And I am going to introduce Elizabeth Manning, who is the Assistant Director at Prince Memorial Library, to introduce our speaker tonight. Just bear with me for a moment. I will get Elizabeth here. I apologize. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. There are still people coming in. Thank you for setting aside this time. As Kelly said, the video will be available. It will be recorded and you'll be able to watch it and share it with your friends and your community and your network. Tonight, when we were thinking about the second person in the Changemaker series, it was a pretty obvious choice for us because Dustin Ward is a known entity to us. He helped us put on a race and equity series in which we chose 3 books, and Dustin guided us through. The 3 books were specific to issues of race in this country. And it was such a great response that we did it twice. I would study with Dustin forever if I could. Dustin is the founder and president of It Is Time, a group that provides education, advocacy, and assistance to organizations, schools, churches, towns, just about any entity that sees the need for truth and reconciliation work. So Dustin, welcome. It's nice to see you. It's nice to work with you again.
Right, it's good to be back. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to give folks a little bit of your background because every story in Maine is unique, but yours is particularly unique. You were adopted as an infant, and you grew up in Presque Isle, Maine.
Absolutely, yes.
So I've never been to Presque Isle, and I was curious, so I went on Wikipedia, and the population was more than I thought. Presque Isle is actually a fairly big city, probably the biggest city in Aroostook County, with about 9,000 people. That surprised me. Spread out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you were class of Presque Isle 2006, is that right? Your high school class? And you went on to USM and you studied economics and politics, is that correct?
You got it. Poli-sci major with an economics minor.
And it looked as though you were headed to law school, but then there was a change, a pretty significant change, right?
Absolutely, yes. So a calling on my life, as the term is used, a calling on my life to change in a different direction in the ministry.
Yeah. So you ended up studying theology and you worked as a pastor. And as I understand it, when George Floyd died in 2020, that was kind of a galvanizing point for you. That was maybe a tipping point.
Absolutely, that was a catalyst to move the conversation more so out of my own personal processing and rumination into really saying, okay, it's time to do something. That I could not sit on the sideline any longer. And so much of what happened in that moment and over that course of those 2 weeks galvanized for me what this business is really all about, is to really bring that reconciliation, that bridge, but also advocate, because it was and it still is time to really make change and to do something different.
Yeah. And so that being the call to action, you founded this organization. You've got a lot going on personally, right? 2 little boys.
Oh yeah.
And you live now in New Gloucester, which actually has half of the population of Fort Kent, which was another surprise for me. I'm sorry, of Presque Isle. And one thing, when we did our race and equity series, reading, becoming aware of a situation, but at the end, you would always end it with this call to action. What are the next steps? What do you do from here? And I'm really impressed that in your own life, you're doing that in local politics. And you ran for the select board in New Gloucester. And in addition to your own business, a growing family, now you're also involved in local politics. And I'm supremely impressed. So congratulations on winning that seat. And that's what I've got for an introduction on you. So if you want to take it from here, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. Well, let me say first to everybody in attendance, thank you so much for taking the time, even just to listen to me. It is a busy time, but it's good work. It's good work that we are doing, and I'm delighted to be able to have the opportunity to do it. A lot of what our organization looks to do is anything from facilitation. We have worked with schools. We are working with schools, smaller book groups. We're helping local Black farmers. We're helping Black and brown individuals in local town offices and getting their voices in there. So a lot is happening. But what I wanted to sort of do is answer that question that you sort of posed, which is, what is advocacy? What is activism? And sort of just kind of process that with all of us here tonight. Because that's what really I'm coming into this season, especially this year, trying to answer for a lot of folks. And so I'll take you back to 2006, right? And I want to sort of walk this through my own eyes and my own experience. In 2006, I'm coming out of a tough high school experience. My racial world was really all white. Presque Isle is absolutely a very white context, but the adoption agency that I went through, there are about 5 or 6 other multi-ethnic or Black kids that came through there. So I did grow up with a few other individuals that looked like me and were also adopted. But as I come out of a high school experience that is trying to rack my head around what does it mean to be in all white spaces at all times, I leave and say, okay, I don't want to be in Presque Isle anymore. And I find myself at the University of Southern Maine. And now we're hitting about 2008, 2010. And as I've moved into Southern Maine, I'm making sort of my home there, building my resume and my political science degree. This is the moment where I see the first Black president. And I see him elected and inaugurated. And there was this sort of glaze that I think we all looking back had, like, we did it, right? Here's the moment. Things are going to change. And I sort of say, this is a moment where a new era is being ushered in, that we are able to maybe subdue racism. And if you remember, we read in Begin Again by Eddie Glaude. He says that was a mistake. We misread that whole thing. And so as much as the Black community was so delighted to be able to have that opportunity to see this moment, those issues of racism didn't go away. In fact, they enlarged, they grew more. And so by misreading that, we sort of weren't prepared for what was coming. So by the time we come out of that, 2012 hits. And I'll never forget February 2012, because that was when we all went through and witnessed the death of Trayvon Martin. And I'll never forget watching that trial. I was going and hoping to be a new graduate in law school, but what I witnessed was an acquittal of a young kid who had been really murdered. And not just murdered, but when we witnessed that, the conversation now shifted where we are seeing just the way Black individuals dress, the way in which we operate, just walking home, we are now seen as dangerous. And so you take that moment and there's this calling on my life to now shift and go to seminary. And so I do thinking that is where I'm supposed to be. That's my next moving spot. So this is now 2013, January 2013. And in that year, as I begin my seminary degree, this is when Michael Brown gets killed. And this is where the Ferguson riots happen. And this is where the discussion sort of now awakens about police violence. It had always been there, but in my era, this is now where it came back. And since Rodney King, we had not really had open discussions about police brutality until that moment. And we watched the protests and we watched how the Black community was really being portrayed in all of that. And even after all of those protests and all that conversation, there still didn't seem very massive change. And this is where the beginnings of Black Lives Matter come. And many articles say it was probably started in 2013 and it will ramp up as we move forward. But those ideas, that concepts, those all start in about 2013. But here I am, I'm in a church environment. I've completely shifted my realm. And so by being in the church environment, the seminary actually tried to have these conversations. And there were courses that were actually offered. I took both of them, are ethnic and racial studies. And there was one called Biblical and Global Justice. And what was happening was the church was trying to move towards this conversation, but they used the term, let's be a more multicultural church. And I put that in quotes because I don't think we ever got to, what did that really mean? And the way it functioned was, you want to be inclusive, but your inclusivity is, if we can just get the faces in the seats, everything will be better. But we never really dealt with the actual problem. Nobody ever changed their own biases. Nobody unveiled the issues that were really deep inside. And so actually white folks didn't really need to operate any different. So the rhetoric within the church environment grew more volatile, it grew more toxic, and it grew more misguided. Not only that, and this is only 2013, we continue on to see more murder and death of Black men and women. And let me remind you of those names. Now, there are very many, but here are just some that I remember seeing. Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray, which was only in 2015, Walter Scott. And what we should recognize is we have been experiencing Black trauma for far too long. I'm remembering those images of Black death that is so visible and it is so traumatic. And to see death upon death and to see people protesting, each one, the Black community rising up and saying, we have got to change. And as we see that footage, we then live that trauma, but we still don't see any change. We build upon that trauma, but there's no healing. There's suppressed pain. And as we got into the church realm, there was nowhere to go with that pain. Nobody was talking about these issues. So what ends up happening is by the end of 2015, I get a calling in my spirit to go back home. I'm supposed to be doing ministry in Maine. And so that's when we left Massachusetts and went back home to Maine. I was still in seminary and still wanted to complete my degree, but now it's 2016. And if we want to remember 2016 for just a moment, those were the most pivotal 4 years of racial issues and politics that we in my generation have seen, because we heard openly hurtful, vile, and painful rhetoric. There was this increased sense of hatred. These stereotypes now became part of the everyday conversation. It was on full display. People felt more emboldened to sort of react more aggressively towards anybody that was non-white. And there was this belief that you could disregard someone's race and ethnicity and their culture, this sense of less than if you were not white or normal. And then we got a sense of twistedness with patriotism and Americanism, and those words took on very different meanings than they once did. And now I bring you to where the world stops in 2020. We come out of that 4 years and we have a pandemic and our gaze sort of shifts. But for me, I'm remembering the weekend of May 28th, Memorial Day weekend. And I remember, we all do, watching that video. We witnessed that all together. And we felt like our world stopped. And for the Black community, it truly did. Because personally, for me, June 2nd, after I had witnessed that, I put my statement out. Personal statement, 2 pages. And I wanted to put pen to paper that said, this is it. Enough is enough. And I actually put that same statement in front of my ministry board. And they rejected it. And the comments and the vile rhetoric came full blown. Something that I had seen previously, but here it was before me. And so the world, I felt, sort of said the same thing. And I take you through this timeline, sort of this chronological understanding of what my eyes have seen and maybe what your eyes have seen as well, so that you can first understand why. Why are we here? Why are we at this point? We have to answer these 2 questions. What is advocacy? What is activism? It's because of what preceded. The Black community has been watching Black death and pain, and it has been building and building, and we've been shouting and we've been wanting change for so long. But then came Memorial Day weekend, and then came 2020. At that point, the global community couldn't stomach seeing one more death. And the world finally said enough was enough. We all witnessed that. And so that, to me, is this critical moment where the global world actually got on the same page. And that is where I said, it is time. Those folks were the 3 words that began that personal statement that is on my website, it's on my Facebook. I plastered it all over because I personally wanted to put in writing and say, we've got to do something. And I think the rest of the collective community and the collective world that was around me at the time began to realize, okay, there truly is racism, which is ironic that it took us this long, but there was this sense that, okay, we get it now. What we watched and what we witnessed, that was the critical moment. And so initially what was shrugged off as sort of how that happens, now this realization that this disregard for Mr. Floyd's human life had to have been racially driven. And thus we are now ushered into this new era. And this was the sentence that I got so much in the first part of 2020 and into 21. I want to do something. That was the era that I started to live in. I want to do so, the era of action. And there was this moment where there was sort of action as a reaction. We're all witnessing, white, Black, everybody's witnessing this. And white folks are beginning to ask, what can I do? I want to jump in. Now I want to change something. And I truly felt there was a desire to react to this specific image of death that we had all seen, but also something that the Black community had been fighting for so long. And now white folks are sort of catching up. But I also think there was this desire to fix what was really uncovered. That as we all learned, and you remember, Elizabeth, when we first did those book groups, we all were learning together. I was unveiling new information that many people had never even heard of. And I think at that point, it wasn't just let's fix this one situation. It's recognizing and reconciling the 400 plus years of Black pain and death. And then how do we reconcile this last decade that we've all lived through? So the question that was asked is, well, how do I take action? How can I be part of a solution? How can I advocate? How can I become an activist in this work? And that's a lot of what my action was. That was my reaction was, I want to first advocate for Black and brown individuals. That's first and foremost and primary for anything that I do. And for me, I felt enough wasn't being done. So it was time for me to focus my full energy on it. So I stepped away completely from ministry in 2020 so I could dedicate myself to this. And the second part is not just advocate, but reconcile. How do we bridge that gap of white and Black individuals together? How do we fix that chasm that has grown because of the conversation where we're missing one another? Why this change hasn't happened after all of this death? Where can we find that common ground and bridge that back? And thus the business was sort of created and established this major model. It's 3 parts: learn, think, and act. And that to me is how you get people into action and into activism. That to me was the path that I could chart for, is that I could bring to individuals who were asking this question so that they all could logically get there. So I want to sort of answer that for you. What did it mean to get to that point? What does it mean to advocate and to be an activist? First off, advocacy and its success starts with learning. And I truly think this last year, this is what we've all done. We've learned. This has been a lot of learning, a lot of information out there. And the reason that we learn is so that you at home, you wherever you are, but you in the general, you know where the pain comes from. I educate my clients and my partners and my stakeholders because I need to illuminate what they don't know. And I need to bring that information to them so that they understand, why are we at this point? Because if you don't answer the why, then you don't know why you're acting in the first place. And so much of what I had been doing, and I still do to some degree, is I try to educate and unveil. There's so much history we were all not taught. Some of it we had to self-teach. And I know that's what I did a lot in high school, is self-taught. But now it's coming to light. And that's where I want to bring that to people, illuminate what has been hidden for so long. But that work also begins with what I call buy-in. And any organization that I work with, man, success starts when leaders are committed to the work. That's where change first happens. Those in power and those who are decision makers have to buy in. So some of my first conversations with any organization or any group is, get to know. I want to know who I'm working with, what is our background, and they want to get to know me. Who am I? Sort of the introduction that you had tonight. But I also want to assess their buy-in. And my question is, are you willing to go the distance with me? Are you willing to really put it all on the line? Because if that's not answered, and if there's not that commitment, it's going to fail halfway through. And so for me, I always want to know, where's my buy-in and where are my stakeholders? Because those are the ones that have to really commit first. And then it trickles down. So if I get those 2 things, the third thing that I need, that any advocacy on a large scale is going to require large scale buy-in. And what that means is we have to go to the mat and begin to be representatives of change in every sphere that we're at. We all need to commit to this work. So it's not just me as the collaborator who goes in these organizations and makes them commit. There is a universal and a global commitment. It's what we saw in 2020, but it's beginning to start to wane, I feel. That this commitment, I've done this for a year, I'm starting to be a little bit too tired of it. And that's where we got to really push forward. And that buy-in is all or nothing. You got to commit all in. You cannot cherry pick. And I think sometimes that's what folks want to do, is say, well, I like to do that and I want to make my racial statement, but you want me to change everything I do? I don't know if I can do that. And that's not what advocacy even begins with. We've got to have that large scale buy-in. So secondly, if that's part of advocacy, here's the next step that I need. And when I get into many of these organizations, I've had the conversation, I've sort of walked them through that, I've checked in on their buy-in. The next piece is advocacy is all about ownership. And let me tell you, this is the hardest part. This is the hardest part for especially white individuals to have. And I want to explain, because I think this is what we're witnessing now. We need to have folks take responsibility of their past and past wrongs and harm. And I am finding that this is where white folks get the most offended, is at this stage, because there's a major misunderstanding. The word that is coming up is, I'm feeling attacked. And that's because you're being asked to take ownership of a harm that was caused. Maybe it wasn't caused directly by you, but you know the past harms that have brought it to bear. And so maybe it's harms that are caused by words, or maybe it's harm that is caused by action. And for me, I'm remembering those jokes, that rhetoric, those remarks, that, well, that's just how it is kind of blasé attitude. What we're saying is, you need to take ownership of that now. And that is going to feel like an attack, because at no other time in our history have we truly stood up and called out to the magnitude that we are of saying that is not going to happen any longer. That's why it feels like an attack. But it's not a vendetta. It's saying that we're going to do things different, that we're going to actually operate in a different way. And that's what taking responsibility of past actions is all about. That's where advocacy really has the rubber meet the road. But then I would add, it isn't just past actions. Can you take responsibility for your future harm? Because we're all going to make mistakes. And are you going to be able to own what you will do? Because we're all going to be learning. We're all going to be processing. Nobody's going to make it perfect on day one. So can you take responsibility for the future harm that you do? And with that, what I say is, okay, can the Black community, I'm going to talk to my Black brothers and sisters, can the Black community fess up and say, okay, we will work to accept genuine ownership, but we will also call out disingenuine approaches as well? Because I think sometimes we need to really work at assessing, are we genuine about this or are we not? And not just blanket statements saying, well, that wasn't good enough. I think there's some genuine attempts out there. And I do my best to make sure that we know what the difference is. So for me, taking responsibility is a huge piece of what advocacy is all about. The final piece, before I get into activism, advocacy is all about being humble. It's about humility. And here's what I mean by that. It requires a person to lower themselves to elevate the other. And I know, Elizabeth, in some of our book groups, that's one thing that I preach towards the end, is this concept of really love. But as a white individual, can you sacrifice yourself for the elevation of any other race? That's the true testament. That's tough as well, but that's what leads to empathy and compassion and that love. And this is where I say that's where a person thinks. You've learned, you've done the ownership, you've taken stock of yourself, you have the buy-in, but that's going to lead you to the empathy. If you can get past those, that's where you think. You begin to personalize. And thus you take what you know and you can see where the other person is coming from. And it allows a humble approach to racial equity. You can then move past those feelings of guilt, shame, and hurt, which I know are the stumbling blocks of a lot of folks, because that's what you're afraid of feeling. I don't want to feel shame. I don't want to feel hurt. I get that. And as a white individual, I recognize that. But we should be able to process through it. You can't stay there. You can't stay in guilt and shame, because that's not going to lead to any action. You'll just be spinning your wheels. So for me, the thinking process helps you get past that, because once you empathize, you turn something to actual love and compassion and care. So here's what I say. Okay, if you can learn, you understand the origins and history, if you can think, you can empathize and personalize, then you can move into action. So what is action? What is this? Activism? Activism is advocacy in motion. And you can put that on a bumper sticker or a tattoo if you want, but activism is advocacy in motion. It's the response of all these key components. You've bought into change in policies and processes and commitments. You've taken ownership of your past and future wrongs. You've elevated someone else above yourself. You've learned, you thought, now you can take action. And now you know that it's genuine action. You're not just doing it because it's a fad or because you thought, well, everybody else is doing it. You truly have processed and gone through it. So what does that look like? I tell folks, one of the things is speaking up and speaking out. Too often people just stay quiet, and that is never going to help. So it could be calling out harmful rhetoric, and that creates a culture change. And that's really what we're about, is changing a culture. How do you counter a rhetoric? You address what's said. You maybe state, hey, that hurt me to hear that, or that made me uncomfortable. You give reasons why it's harmful. Maybe you got to take that conversation as a one-on-one, take it to a more neutral or settled area if you're in a larger group. Maybe you step in and offer some sort of support. You're never fully being the leader in that situation, but maybe you're coming to the aid of someone who is a victim. You're letting those who have been harmed be the initial leaders, but you're showing your support. Or maybe you're checking in with those who have been harmed, especially Black and brown brothers and sisters who are in very white spaces. So for me, it's calling it out, speaking up against it. Second thing is promoting equity. Always being an advocate and an activist in promoting that equity. So that's advancing equitable principles, which is part of what we do as well. It isn't just having the conversation, it's finding out where those principles and ways in which we can move that forward. Maybe you're testifying to the legislator on a law or a bill. That takes a lot of courage to stand up and take ownership and stand for something. Maybe you're vocalizing those issues of racism. Maybe you're taking what you learned and sharing it with other individuals. Maybe you're reworking your own personal rhetoric. You're trying to be less traumatic. Or maybe we take it a step further and it's tearing down or reforming or reframing something. Maybe we're rebuilding whole things. Maybe you're taking apart an inequitable system or reassessing old practices that have been avenues of disenfranchisement. So for instance, housing, economics, health, labor, education, all systems that have progressively gotten more and more disenfranchising to folks who are non-white or Black and brown brothers and sisters. Maybe you're removing those hurdles of discrimination. Maybe it's in the way your documentation states. Maybe it's in the doctrines you have. Think about redoing your hiring policies. Are you assessing your onboarding practices so those are more inclusive? There are so many ways that you can actively, in your spheres of influence, take this to the next level. Or maybe you're advancing justice just across the board. Maybe you're getting active in local politics. Now, folks, if you haven't seen the news, in just the last few months, not just my seat on the select board, but in just the last few months, we have welcomed in at least 6 brand new counselors, school board members who all represent different ethnicities or multicultural individuals. What a change that we've seen in just the last year. And just this week, we have welcomed in a new mayor in South Portland. And so we see this landscape of true change because people are getting up and running for races. They are getting into local politics and they're getting a seat at the decision-making table. So I say, run for something. Tori Pelletier is a dear friend. She'll tell you, run for something. Roberto, he's a dear brother. Run for something. He'll tell you that. These great individuals who are stepping up to the plate and who are brand new are saying, get in there and do something. That's a way that we move justice and we can be active in it. Another way, removing barriers, right? Allowing everybody into these spaces, or maybe moving past just making racial statements. If you don't have a new one that you're working on, work on one, but it can't all be about statements. We got to find areas where we are going to leave a legacy and ask the question, how are you being a good ancestor? How are you leaving true justice as a legacy and not just hoping that the next generation will pick it up? Or maybe you're promoting economic justice, which is one of the major principles that our business wants to do. Economic justice. Are you advancing better monetary principles? Business capital for Black-owned businesses that can be part of your local avenue, your local sphere, your local town or city. Maybe you're trying to bridge the wealth gap, which is one of the things we want to take on as well. How do you fix home ownership? First-time home buying, second-time home buying. That's the way to pass on wealth. Are Black and brown individuals given the same opportunities to own those homes? What about homelessness? Homelessness, even in the state of Maine, is on the rise, and it affects especially Black and brown individuals the most, and other demographics as well. How are we fixing those policies? What about equitable pay and benefits, especially when you look at some of the statistics and the numbers, especially in the job market? COVID-19 exposed that for us so much. How are we addressing childcare and medical and dental? There's so many ways that justice comes out of it, and that's what it means to be an activist. And so for me, as I sort of finish up this point, and now I really want to hear some questions from all of you, but let me end with this. Don't let excuses and fear become the inaction. Don't let excuses and fear be the reason where you're saying, I can't do something, because you all can. Everybody can. But here's what I'd say. If we're going to move forward with advocacy and activism, here's some things that we can work on. First off, let's reassess some rhetoric. And there are people who have said, you can't police speech. I would tell you, listen, if your speech inhibits my freedom, my life, my liberty, my happiness, and causes me trauma and harm, or it inhibits other basic human rights, then that speech is no longer free and it needs to be addressed. So we've got to fix our rhetoric. Second thing we need to do is practice talking about racial equity. We cannot keep avoiding it. We need to openly talk about it. We need to discuss how we can work out these situations so that when we get in our groups and our spheres of influence and at other organizations, it's natural, that it's flowing, that it's important to us, that we're willing to talk about it on a regular basis. How do we help evaluate more safe spaces as well? Diverse people are coming in. They should be able to feel comfortable in sharing their issues in those spaces, especially in an area that's mostly white. And how can we have multiracial or multi-ethnic individuals lead those conversations? Another thing I would say is, can we recognize the trauma that's out there? And this one thing that I don't think is done enough. Black individuals are entering a lot of white spaces right now, and it is improving, but they carry the difficult experiences that they have had. So if we want to really engage in advocacy and activism, we got to be cognizant of the space we create and advocate for those individuals who may not be like us, but we will meet or will come into our spheres and spaces. And we need to acknowledge the visual triggers, the amount that we have witnessed Black death, the trials, the acquittals, and how we have to relive it when we go through those processes. Those are hard to stomach. You have to have a space to be able to let that out and process that. Another thing that we need to do, take all these issues of racism seriously. Let's not minimize racism. Let's realize that we are not trying to say, oh, that's probably not what happened. No, let's discuss these issues. Let's consider it as serious as an emergency. Then we uphold that it is a true and honorable thing to talk about. How do we hold people accountable? How are we making people responsible for the mistakes that they make and that the learning that they will do from that? How do you keep learning? How do you keep speaking up? And finally, let's create a new culture. If we're really going to take on this advocacy and activism, let's make it repetitive so that it becomes our new culture, our new norm. I say normalize diversity and elevate inclusivity. That should be part of the work of equity. So folks, don't lose heart. Don't be too fatigued, because I know it is real. This work is so vital and it is so important. So advocacy and activism can continue on even now, even after this amazing year that we've happened. We've got a long way to go, but I think we have some at least building blocks to move forward in. So with that, I would love to hear some Q&A, Elizabeth. I'm delighted that folks are here and want to hear what people have as questions or thoughts.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for the questions to come in, Dustin, I do want to address a question that I had put the sign out when you were doing the program Race and Equity. And I got a telephone call from a man who took offense with the use, not offense, but he wanted an explanation of why I was using equity instead of equality. And I know we talked about it, but I think that's a good discussion to have tonight too.
Absolutely, and it always depends on who you ask. For me, when equality has been used as a conversation piece, it's usually about giving something to someone to make the amount or the quantity the same. That's different than equity. Equity is really removing or taking down barriers and things that are disenfranchising people of being included in certain spaces. So there's a difference. When you talk equality, you're trying to pour into something that makes it the same for everyone. And that's where people have had an issue with a lot of this conversation. We'll use terms like, oh, this is communism, this is Marxist, right? There's this assumption that we're taking from larger groups and just spreading it out. And that's not what this is at all. It's removing the barriers that keep Black and brown individuals from being able to obtain things that would otherwise create not maybe equal access, but all access to anything. So for instance, housing is an issue. It's not like we're taking someone's house and giving it to someone without a house. We're taking down the barriers that initially were instituted in the 1930s called redlining that didn't allow Black and brown individuals to have homes that were very similar to their white counterparts. If we take down those barriers and we build up home ownership, we're not taking from someone, but we're allowing those barriers by coming down to have individuals to come in. So now everybody's included in that. So that's what I would say. And that's a hard conversation to have in 2 minutes when you're trying to put up a sign. But I think differentiating those pieces, and equity leads us more to justice. Equality leads us more to monetary quantity policies. But to get to justice, we need to go through equity.
Thank you. There's a question from Kate O'Brien, and the question is, what do I need to do to prepare to engage in this work?
A couple of things I'd already stated, but first we got to take inventory, take the individual inventory. Where are your biases? Where are you finding that you are hindered or you are coming up against roadblocks in how you view a lot of this work or this conversation? When you take that individual inventory, and that includes taking the responsibility, looking at your past harm and action, you then need to come out of and say, okay, would I be okay? And would I be able to see my Black and brown brothers and sisters and other groups elevated above myself. And if we can honestly say that, and if you as that individual who's getting ready, if you can honestly say that, you can begin to enter into this work. Because for me, that's coming through that learning process into that empathy and saying, okay, I'm willing to jump now on board. Because one of the things that I think is so vital is that don't just jump into this work because everybody else is doing it. Don't just get in the pool because it's hot and it's a fad and it's the season. That's going to wane on you harder. You're going to grow fatigued faster. When you have a genuine spirit of jumping into this work, even when it gets rough, you still will want to get up in the morning and say, no, I'm ready to go to bat. I'm still ready to do it. And that's what I'm seeing right now is the tipping point. Some people have just jumped in because we're all having the conversation, and others woke up and said, even if it's difficult, I'll still do the work. So that's really the difference. But that's a great question. Uh-oh, you're muted, and I know you got a good question.
Just noticed that. Another question from Victoria Pelletier. What are important things white allies can remember when they want to amplify Black and brown voices without centering themselves or taking up too much space? That's a terrific question.
It's a terrific question. And I love that she's in the building. So shout outs to Tori for being here. And I appreciate the question. A lot of things that white allies can first begin to do. Don't make the situation about the individual feelings. Feelings can get in the way, the shame, the guilt, those then become more centered on an individual. Let Black and brown individuals lead the conversation first. Let them be the voice that is centered most in the room. Another thing that folks can do is begin to really look at how you assist in the work that you do. So as you're thinking about how do I take that next step or take that action, ask questions, get clarifying information. Don't just jump in and think, I know what to do, and then just do it. Again, this is allowing Black and brown voices to lead. Also, put some of that personal experience, and I've personally been going through this, for white individuals, put personal experience on the side and center the reality of the trauma and the harm that could have been caused. Too much of the time, we sort of bypass the racial trauma and we try to parallel our own personal experience. And we say, hey, I experienced this too. And we try to parallel someone's experience, and that diminishes and minimizes what someone's going through. Put that off to the side for a moment. That can be addressed later. Begin to really process and talk through what someone has just felt. And then when all of those things have happened, begin to recognize how you can speak up and speak out. Choose words carefully, but always be asking, always be clarifying. Those are key things for me. I know Tori is a great advocate as well, and she has added to that conversation too. But those to me are so critical, because in our spheres of influence, you know, our harm is going to look different, but it's still going to be harmful. And so we want to sort of put ourselves off to the side, and white allies need to come up and be supports, be confidants, be people who assist. So I would offer those up.
Thank you. Beth Blakeman-Pohl asks, can you talk about when a race thinks of equity as something those in power, in quotations, can give to one another?
Say that first part again. I didn't really hear it.
She's asking if you could talk about when a race thinks of equity as something those in power can give to one another.
I see. I would describe it, and I think what the question is asking, when Black and brown individuals look at power dynamics and power structures, those in power are the ones who are the major decision makers, and what they can begin to do is to break down those barriers, break down those systems that have been impeding or harming or hindering Black and brown individuals from stepping into different areas of influence. So when we talk power dynamics, so much of what we experience and what we go through in our world is being held by a very small amount. And that's dangerous, because not all the voices then are in the conversation, not all the voices are in the decision-making table. To relinquish some of that power, which is the hardest thing. When I was in grade school, they tell me the hardest thing to let go is power. But when you let go of that power, you are allowing other individuals and other voices into that decision-making table. So what I would say, if I'm understanding the question correctly, Black and brown individuals are looking to say that power structure of where it's all held in one small area needs to be relinquished so that others can come in and be part of the power structure, part of the system. It is not a takeover. It is a shared, equitable assessment of where all that power is held. Too often it is held really in white men. And that's what we've been noticing. And that's what our world has sort of been built around. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to enter into a new space with that.
Thanks. Okay, Kayla Rothier asks, what talking points do you recommend using when talking about race with our young children?
Whew, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I'll personally talk about that we're using with our kids, and maybe add a few others, we want to expose them to every culture that is possible. Because what I want them to understand is that the world that they may see around them is not the totality of their world. If there's anything that I learned growing up in Presque Isle, is that it was assumed that the world around me was the normal world, and that was normalized. So one talking point I would say is you want to teach your children to be exposed and to learn from other cultures and not to mimic, because now you're getting into cultural appropriation. Don't take pieces of the culture and try to expose them as the end all be all of that culture. Take pieces of the culture and learn about it, understand it. Why do they do certain practices? That to me is the first step. Telling your children how to learn and teaching them literally how to learn from someone else who may not operate or act or practice the same things or think the same things that they do. Another talking point I would have about this conversation of race is be open and honest. Don't try to bypass, or what I call colorblind racism. Don't say, oh, no, we don't talk about that. Or no, that person isn't X, Y, and Z. Or assuming someone's ethnic background based on the skin color. Teach your children how to ask good questions, clarifying questions. Teach them also how to have relationships. One of the things that is too often done is that that adults actually will go into it thinking that we try to parallel our lives. So we ask these awkward questions. Where are you from? Wait for those opportunities to learn about where someone might be from. That's all about building relationships. So teach your kids young, how do you have relationships? How do you build that trust so that those types of conversations can come very easily? But be open and honest. Tell your children, I don't know some things. Let's go ask. Let's go get clarifying. Let's go get clarity. Those are things that I would do. But for me, we're exposing our children young to varying different cultures, backgrounds, especially this year in a holiday season. People celebrate differently. We should be teaching our children, how do we all celebrate this holiday season differently?
Thank you. Sally Bancroft writes, it's more of a comment, but I'll read it out loud. It is so hard to find opportunities in such a white community as Cumberland to have these conversations with people of color that come with advocacy. One thing we can do is advocate for schools, make sure students know the real history of our country, acknowledging injustice throughout our history. And Dustin, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna make a plug for the book that came in today, which is the 1619 project, which was kind of a groundbreaking work from the New York Times. And the book is here. There are no holds on it yet, but people can place their holds. But if you want a comment on Sally's observations.
Absolutely. And so this is actually a really great point that's made, that we sometimes need to shift the misnomer. First off, statistics will show that every county, and possibly every city, but every county, at least in the state of Maine, has at least someone who is represented as someone who is a person of color, Black or brown. So this idea that there are no folks in certain areas is a misnomer. And now that has grown. Statistically, we have seen certain counties and many cities garnering or gaining multi-ethnic or multiracial individuals. So it's all about, how do you expose yourself to what's out there? I will grant you that it is mostly white, but there are spaces and places, maybe not just in Cumberland, but throughout, where there are great organizations and great individuals who are promoting conversations. And let me also get this out too. Don't just go to Portland and think, let me run into the first Black individual I see. Don't just go to Lewiston, Auburn and think, well, I'm just going to run into someone there and that way I'll be exposed. Go to all throughout the state, because there are different Black and brown individuals from varying backgrounds. We are all not a monolith. we vary differently in the sense that we have different things to offer. So I will recognize the reality that, yeah, it feels like it's an all white space, but statistically, and the reality is that given this world of the internet and how connected we truly are, expose yourself to just the varying backgrounds that are out there, especially in this state. And that has grown over the last decade. So this is sort of a call to action. Let's push ourselves to really find those spaces and step out of that comfort zone.
Okay, Gail Witherill makes an observation, another one, and this relates to your points on changing our rhetoric. So here's what Gail has to say. Ideas, I think we need ideas to get around excuses. For example, those that are using the defund the police statement as a reason not to recognize racial inequities. Basically saying, I don't agree about defunding police, thus the Black Lives Matter movement is not of interest to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I appreciate the comment, and yes, there's a argument that gets made where if I don't agree with one principle, I don't have to agree with the whole thing, which is ironic because I've never met any Christians, and I come from a specific evangelical background, that would do that. Some people don't agree with everything, but I've never seen them completely disregard a whole religion. You don't do that logically. Normally, you would never do that. You may not like a piece of your house. Do you just not like the whole house? So that logical argument does not make sense. However, I do know that it is being used to sort of downplay critical race theory conversations. Same idea. I don't like the way we're making our kids feel this shame, so I don't like talking about race at all. It's the same idea. We need to one, drill down on our terms, right? That's our first problem. We throw these terms out: defund police, Black Lives Matter, critical race. We throw these out. We don't put any context around them. We don't have universal understanding of what they mean. And then we can basically draw our own logical arguments from it. And that's what's so difficult. But I recognize the comment, and I know it's out there. It's happening. How do we work against that? How do we define our terms? And let's all agree on how we define the terms. I think when you drill down, though, once you get past that, people just have certain fears or certain angsts about little pieces, and then they use it to sort of just blow up the whole thing. So it's unfortunate, but it is true. So I appreciate the comment.
Yeah, it's a good comment. And it, slogans can be great. They can galvanize people, but they can also be kind of shortcuts and shut people off. Yeah. Okay, we have a question from someone that wants to remain anonymous. And this person says, I feel like my boss could really use hearing this kinds of things that you're saying. Do you have any recommendations for how I might break open this conversation with my company's leaders?
And again, it's a great question. I don't know the context of the organization. Couple of thoughts that come to mind. Could stepping to HR be an opportunity, right? Use the resources that you have. Sometimes going directly to a boss can again play into power dynamics. So I don't know, the gender of the boss. I don't know those kind of things, but I do know that if I'm a Black female going to a white male, there's a power dynamic in having that conversation. And there may be more fear to speak up against these things. So recognize the power dynamics. If you have other resources at your disposal, use them. So use your HR, use maybe another mediary who can go to that individual and say, hey, how do we address issues of racial equity? Depending on the relationship you may have with your boss, this may be an opportunity during one-on-one meetings. I would say annual review, but those are dangerous to bring these topics up. But maybe you're having staff meetings or opportunities where you coordinate and talk, and maybe you say ahead of time, hey, a couple of things I want to bring up, and give someone a heads up. I'd like to talk about these things, and be honest with them. There's these bullet points that I'd like to bring up. Can we find a safe space to be able to do that? So get out ahead of it and just say, I want to create that safe space. Can we do that? I think if it is a good boss, that individual will at least acknowledge and recognize their employee has a desire from them. That makes them a better boss. Now, my hope is that they will recognize that, and you can be prepared to have that conversation. So the dual answer is use your resources that are available to you. Maybe you got to go through a third or a mediary or someone who can kind of mediate that conversation, or give the heads up. Say, hey, I have a meeting coming up with you. I want to create a safe space for this. Can we talk about these issues, and just, can you hear me out? And that's the other thing too. Don't make it an argument. Maybe it's just, can you hear me out? Ruminate on it, think about it, marinate, and then we'll do a follow-up meeting. So these are good ways we can create good conversation and good rhetoric.
Yep. He or she could also leave your card on the boss's desk, right?
You could, yes, you could always do that. You can send them right to itistime.me if they want to create a collaboration agreement with you. Oh, I'm always ready for that.
Okay. All right. A question from Jay Campbell. Can you give some advice for white people on making space for BIPOC individuals to lead while not expecting Black and brown people to take on labor, including emotional labor?
Absolutely. So I appreciate this question because it's similar to what Tori's asking, but it takes it one step further in the sense that one of the things that always gets that happens is we become the ones who bear the burden of having the conversation. The first thing that I would say is allow Black and brown individuals to take a rest and to come into that conversation at their leisure and at their pace. So as a white individual, maybe you really want to have this conversation, bring it into whatever sphere of influence that you have. The best thing that you can do is simply just reach out and say, listen, I'm hoping that we have a good enough relationship. I can ask you a question. If that relationship is not there, build that relationship first. And do not go into that relationship having this agenda that you want to take something from a Black or brown individual. Go into the relationship saying, I want to know you better because I want to build a true friendship. As that friendship builds, then you can maybe approach those conversational pieces saying, hey, I'm wondering if you can help me. I'm wondering if you can provide for me. And if you don't, take the space you need. So allow Black and brown individuals to take the rest they need or to enter into it if they have the energy and the ability to do so. But I can't stress enough, so much of what happens is non-relational, is transactional, and we grow tired of it being transactional. Create the relationship, build that. And if we don't want to have the relationship, allow that as well. So that's what I would say as a white individual to be cognizant of that and to allow for that space and allow for that grace in that, because Black individuals are processing at different rates and at different levels. So if one individual is not ready, that's okay. Move on to finding other avenues to have that conversation. That's a great question. So.
Oh. Okay, we've got not a lot of time left. We want to honor people's time, but we have two great questions. The first one here is from Wayne Cobb. And Wayne writes, I understand that there are a certain number of people of color in Greater Portland, but where are the spaces where fruitful cross-cultural encounters can occur?
I like that question because honestly, I think the answer that is sort of coming out of this is maybe there can be more. I think there are places that are doing it. A lot of nonprofits, a lot of organizations in the Portland area, but I would say even expanded, are working to do that. First organization that comes to mind is Third Place. Dear Sister Adila is working to be that bridge to create community spaces for Black and brown individuals and to create spaces to bring cultures together. So I know there are groups who are doing it. I think what we're missing is maybe we want more. Maybe we're hungry for more to have that cross-cultural. And I think we're in an era right now where we're rebuilding trust globally. We have gone through so much, as I stated, Black trauma, Black pain. We are still rebuilding the trust with our white allies. And that's going to take some time. So we're not ready to just sit down and break bread and make everything good. And I had a couple of churches who said, well, we just want to go worship with a Black church. I said, pump the brakes. We're not there yet. So maybe we just need more time to create this healing that will allow us to say, okay, where are the spaces we can come and break bread with one another? Some folks are ready. Others are still, there's still a bit of trepidation. So I would say be patient, but allow the Black and brown community to maybe keep having those conversations. Where can we build that? It's coming. I think it's just slowly happening as we gain our bearings and move forward.
Yeah, and I would hope that libraries would make it on the list too, as a natural place where people can come together. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so the last question for the night, it's a wonderful one, and it's from Judith Blanchard, and she writes, apropos Gail's question about, that was the one with using slogans, kind of. How does one address those who see Black Lives Matter as a monolithic organization that is frightening and or threatening to police or whites generally?
first thing I do, and I do a lot of this in terms of the education that I talk about, I start with addressing the reality, which is, yes, we witnessed buildings being burned and we witnessed protests and fights in the streets. But we also have witnessed years of police brutality, years of historic enslavement, years of Black pain and death. Can you understand maybe why we're a bit upset? So anytime I teach this, I say, I will grant you what you're seeing, but I will give you context for it. And that is the previous years of pain and suffering that is bringing us to this point. The other thing that I would also add is the data. The data as of the last 2 years shows us that 95% of Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful, 5% are not. So on general, Black Lives Matter as an organization has promoted peace and safety. And even Martin Luther King, in the age of protests with the Watts riots, Detroit riots, also did the same thing. He said, I know the reality. There is pain that Black and brown individuals are feeling, but we want to do as much as we can to create peace. And that's what Black Lives Matter is doing. I would also not conflate the organization with the idea that really what we're trying to say is what came out of the Ferguson riots is saying we need to recognize the value that Black lives have. And that's getting lost. So when you're having this discussion, when I talk, especially with police departments, I say, again, I'll grant you what you're witnessing, but don't conflate that and throw everything out. Understand that at the core of what we're saying is we want people to recognize Black Lives Matter, because what we've been witnessing is that they don't seem to be. That's why we're having the conversation. How an organization takes that, organizations can rise and fall, empires rise and fall. It happens. But what the organization is trying to do is to bring the awareness. And at least they're getting us aware. And at least we are now taking notice. So if you're having a conversation, I know those are quick bullet points. It's always good, recognize the reality, but present the data, and then say, but understand the context. And that helps you get past this sort of straw man argument.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dustin. It's always a pleasure. I always learn something from you. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Our hour is up. Dustin's website is It Is Time. And thank you. Kelly?
Thank you.
You're muted, Kelly.
I knew that would happen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you're interested in a recording, I will get that out to the mailing list probably tomorrow. So anyone who missed it, or if you want to forward the information to a friend or someone that you know, expect that in your inbox tomorrow. Thank you very much, Dustin. Thank you, Elizabeth. And good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.